The removal of personal boundaries inside Viking longhouses imposed a continuous biological load on the human body, independent of social intention or cultural meaning. Archaeological measurements provide the physical constraints. Most Viking longhouses offered interior widths of 6 to 7 meters. When hearths, wall benches, storage areas, and working zones are subtracted, the remaining shared volume was limited. Reconstructions based on floor area and occupancy estimates indicate an average of approximately 2 to 3 square meters per person during periods of full household presence. This level of density is biologically significant. Modern physiological research shows that sustained living conditions below 4 square meters per person measurably alter sleep quality, thermoregulation, and stress hormone regulation. These effects do not require extreme crowding or acute stressors. They emerge under continuous exposure. Within the longhouse, bodies shared the same enclosed air mass for extended periods. Heat accumulated, moisture increased, carbon dioxide levels rose. Experimental reconstructions of Viking-age longhouses with active hearths have recorded CO2 concentrations exceeding 2,000 ppm during winter conditions. At these levels, contemporary studies demonstrate reduced sleep depth, increased fatigue, and impaired autonomic regulation, even in otherwise healthy individuals. Sleep was particularly affected. Viking sleeping platforms functioned as collective surfaces rather than individual beds. Osteological wear patterns and ethnographic parallels suggest that multiple individuals slept side by side on the same raised bench. Physical separation was minimal. During sleep, bodies remained within reach of one another. Physiological recovery depends on sustained periods of reduced sensory input. Polysomnographic research demonstrates that even low-intensity auditory or tactile disturbance fragments slow-wave sleep. In shared sleeping environments, disturbances propagate. A single movement, cough, or shift in posture produces secondary arousals in nearby sleepers. The consequence is not total sleep deprivation, but chronic fragmentation. Fragmented sleep does not produce immediate collapse. It produces cumulative load. Cortisol levels remain elevated. Muscle repair is incomplete. Immune response efficiency declines. Studies on chronic partial sleep disruption show that metabolic and cognitive impairments accumulate even when total sleep duration appears sufficient. Daytime conditions inside the longhouse reinforced this pattern. The same enclosed volume used for sleep was also used for food preparation, tool work, textile production, and childcare. These activities overlapped spatially and temporally. There was no architectural separation between exertion and rest. Periods of physical stillness occurred in the presence of nearby movement and noise. Under such conditions, the nervous system rarely receives a clear signal of safety. Sympathetic activation remains partially engaged. Stress does not present as discrete episodes. It becomes ambient. Neuroendocrine research shows that environments lacking reliable withdrawal cues prevent full parasympathetic recovery. Over time, the body adapts by dampening responsiveness rather than resolving activation. This adaptation allows continued function but narrows physiological range. Children developed within this baseline. Osteological evidence from Viking-age juvenile remains shows markers consistent with chronic physiological stress, including enamel hypoplasia and growth interruption lines. While influenced by multiple factors, these markers align with environments characterized by persistent crowding, smoke exposure, and incomplete recovery rather than acute trauma. From infancy, sensory density was constant. Touch, sound, and movement were unavoidable. Nervous system calibration occurred under conditions of continuous exposure. Baseline arousal levels were set higher. Sensitivity to proximity decreased not because proximity was harmless, but because it was permanent. Importantly, this biological adaptation did not register as dysfunction within the population. There was no contrasting physiological baseline against which it could be measured. Regulation adjusted quietly. Recovery expectations shifted. The cost of this adaptation did not appear as visible breakdown. It appeared as endurance, as muted response, as the capacity to continue operating without full restoration. When personal boundaries are removed at the physical level, the body does not resist overtly. It recalibrates. And recalibration, sustained across years, reshapes how fatigue, effort, and rest are experienced. This biological recalibration did not define Viking society by itself, but it formed the bodily foundation upon which all further adaptation rested. If constant proximity imposed a background load on the body, the nervous system absorbed that load continuously. Inside Viking longhouses, sensory input rarely fell to baseline. The environment delivered simultaneous stimulation through sound, heat, odor, particulate matter, and movement. None of these inputs were extreme in isolation. Their physiological impact emerged through duration. Experimental reconstructions of Iron Age and Viking Age longhouses provide measurable parameters. With central hearths active, indoor particulate concentrations routinely exceeded modern safety thresholds. Recorded PM 2.5 levels in reconstructed dwellings range from approximately 200 to over 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter during sustained occupation. By comparison, modern health standards identify prolonged exposure above 25 micrograms per cubic meter as harmful. This exposure was not episodic. During winter months, hearths burned for extended periods. Ventilation was deliberately limited to preserve heat. Smoke accumulated unevenly beneath the roof, descending intermittently as air currents shifted. Inhabitants remained exposed for hours each day, across weeks and seasons. Chronic inhalation of fine particulate matter produces predictable biological effects. Modern respiratory studies link sustained PM 2.5 exposure to airway inflammation, reduced pulmonary efficiency, elevated systemic inflammatory markers, and increased susceptibility to infection. These effects emerge gradually. They do not require acute smoke events. For the nervous system, smoke functioned as a persistent stress signal. Irritated airways, burning eyes, and constant odor provided ongoing sensory input associated with environmental threat. Neurophysiological research demonstrates that such input maintains sympathetic nervous system engagement even in the absence of immediate danger. The body remains prepared rather than relaxed. Carbon dioxide concentration reinforced this state. Measurements inside reconstructed longhouses frequently record CO2 levels between 1,500 and 2,500 parts per million during periods of high occupancy and reduced airflow. At these concentrations, modern studies show measurable declines in cognitive performance, increased fatigue, and altered autonomic balance. Heart rate variability decreases, indicating impaired parasympathetic recovery. Under these conditions, recovery was already constrained. The nervous system depends on consistent environmental cues to transition into low activation states. Quiet, clean air, stable temperature, and predictable sensory conditions signal safety. Inside the longhouse, these cues were unreliable. Heat fluctuated with hearth activity. Smoke density shifted unpredictably. Sounds emerged without warning. Sound exposure contributed to this instability. Crowded enclosed interiors typically maintain background noise levels between 40 and 60 decibels, punctuated by intermittent peaks from movement, tools, and animals. Sleep studies show that even low-level continuous noise fragments deep sleep and elevates nocturnal heart rate. Importantly, habituation remains incomplete. Microarousals persist even when noise is familiar. Taken together, smoke, sound, and crowding created an environment without a true sensory floor. The nervous system adapted by broadening attention rather than narrowing it. Instead of cycling between focused engagement and withdrawal, attention remained distributed across the environment. This reduced surprise and allowed rapid response, but it increased baseline activation. Modern neurobiological models describe this state as chronic low-grade hypervigilance. Not acute fear, but sustained readiness. Cortisol rhythms flatten. Autonomic flexibility declines. Emotional range narrows. This adaptation did not feel dramatic. Individuals remained functional. Tasks were completed. Social coordination continued. But physiological regulation operated within a compressed range. Recovery remained incomplete. Stress did not resolve. It diffused. Children developed within this baseline. Developing nervous systems are particularly sensitive to persistent sensory environments. Prolonged exposure to smoke, noise, and crowding during early life alters long-term stress regulation. Pediatric research links early environmental load to reduced autonomic flexibility and heightened baseline arousal later in life. Osteological evidence from Viking Age populations aligns with this pattern indirectly. High prevalence of respiratory pathology, sinus inflammation, and developmental stress markers such as enamel hypoplasia suggests repeated physiological strain rather than isolated trauma. These markers are consistent with chronic exposure environments. Importantly, this process required no conscious endurance. The nervous system recalibrated automatically. Sensitivity decreased. Responsiveness dampened. This allowed continued function within the environment, but it reduced the system's capacity to fully disengage. Over time, the absence of sensory relief reshaped baseline physiology. Heart rate variability remained lower. Sleep depth remained reduced. Inflammatory load remained elevated. These conditions did not signal illness in a contemporary sense. They defined normal operation. Crucially, there was no contrasting condition to reveal the cost. Withdrawal into quiet, clean, isolated space was not available. The nervous system had no reference for full recovery. Regulation adjusted to what existed. The result was endurance without restoration. This endurance allowed survival. But it narrowed the body's margin. And because this narrowing occurred gradually, it did not register as loss. It registered as life. When biological systems operate under sustained load, adaptation has limits. The cumulative effects of constant proximity inside Viking longhouses did not remain confined to regulation and tolerance. Over time, they reduced the body's capacity to absorb additional stress. This reduction marked a transition from adaptation to vulnerability. Respiratory strain illustrates this boundary clearly. Osteoarchaeological analysis of Viking Age skeletal remains shows widespread evidence of chronic sinus inflammation and maxillary bone remodeling. These changes indicate prolonged irritation rather than episodic infection. Modern clinical studies associate such remodeling with reduced airway resilience and increased susceptibility to secondary respiratory disease. At a certain threshold, tolerance becomes depletion. Long-term exposure to fine particulate matter does not merely inflame airways. It alters immune signaling in lung tissue, increasing baseline inflammation while reducing acute response efficiency. Modern epidemiological data show that populations exposed to sustained indoor smoke experience higher mortality from respiratory infections even when nutritional intake is adequate. This pattern limits reserve. In immune systems, reserve determines outcome. When baseline inflammation remains elevated, the margin for mounting effective responses narrows. Infection does not need to be severe to become lethal. Recovery time lengthens. Complications increase. Metabolic systems reached similar constraints. Chronic partial sleep disruption and elevated stress hormones impair glucose regulation and reduce mitochondrial efficiency. Modern studies demonstrate that such conditions lower physical endurance not by reducing strength, but by shortening sustainable output. The body tires sooner. Recovery requires longer intervals. In Viking Age contexts, this translated into earlier functional decline. Skeletal remains frequently show advanced, degenerative joint changes and vertebral compression in individuals who were chronologically young. These changes are inconsistent with acute trauma or isolated overwork. They reflect systems operating near capacity with limited opportunity for repair. Repair capacity matters because it defines longevity. Tissue regeneration depends on coordinated cycles of rest, immune activity, and cellular turnover. When these cycles remain truncated, microdamage accumulates faster than it can be resolved. Pain becomes persistent. Mobility declines. Injury thresholds lower. This shift is irreversible. Once repair capacity falls below damage rate, additional adaptation no longer restores function. The body compensates behaviorally rather than biologically. Effort is reduced. Range of movement narrows. Tasks are modified to fit declining capacity. Children raised under these conditions entered adulthood with reduced reserve. Developmental stress markers such as enamel hypoplasia and growth interruption lines indicate repeated systemic strain during formative years. Modern biological models show that early life stress compresses physiological margin later in life. Tolerance increases. Flexibility decreases. This compression determines survival outcomes. When famine, epidemic, or injury occurred, populations operating with reduced reserve crossed failure thresholds more quickly. Mortality was not caused by single events. It emerged from diminished capacity to recover. Demographic reconstructions reflect this constraint. While many Viking Age individuals survived into adulthood, functional aging occurred earlier. Lifespan measured by years may appear moderate, but lifespan measured by physiological resilience was shortened. The body reached its limits sooner. This marks the endpoint of constant proximity. Not adaptation, not endurance, but exhaustion of margin. The removal of personal boundaries did not produce immediate harm. It produced a slow erosion of reserve. By the time stress exceeded tolerance, recovery was no longer possible. And when biological margin disappears, survival depends not on strength or will, but on luck. That is where constant proximity ultimately leads.